How many people live on planet Earth? And is the population of our planet expected to grow or to fall in the future? The issue of population growth often evokes strong emotions. Elon Musk, for example, believes that we're heading towards a population collapse. He believes that global population will fall. And because of this fall, the world is facing an existential crisis. Elon very clearly would favor higher growth. But contrast this with, for example, the views of Thomas Malthus, a 19th-century economist who believed that population growth can lead to food scarcity and therefore greater poverty. If Malthus were alive today, he and Musk would likely be on two extreme sides of the population debate. But this debate, to do it any justice, would require a far more detailed discussion. Instead, what I want to share with you in this podcast episode is the answer to a more objective, and perhaps less emotive question. Is the population of our planet expected to grow or to fall in the future? I'll try to give you as objective an answer as possible from the best available data we have today. Let's first take a look at the historical data on population. Human population numbers have been climbing since 1950, from about 2.5 billion to 8 billion today. The world population has doubled since Neil Armstrong became the first person on the moon in 1969, and tripled since the discovery of the polio vaccine in 1955. So, the question before us is whether or not the world population will continue to grow. What will be the population in the next quarter of a century? What will be the population at the end of this century? In order to create estimates of future population numbers, we need to examine the historical data for its key insights. Doing this will reveal something you may not have expected. There are two key insights I want to share with you. The first key insight is that even though the world population numbers have been rising, the rate of this growth has been falling. We can see this very clearly in the data. We're almost a quarter of the way through this century. So far, since the year 2000, the world population has grown by 2.1 billion. Compare this to the last quarter of the 20th century, so that's 1975 to 2000, where the population grew by 1.9 billion. In fact, the pattern we're seeing is that the rate of growth has been falling very significantly over the years. This first key insight leads us to naturally ask why. Why is the rate of growth falling? And what is contributing to this fall? This gives us our second key insight. The reason for the fall in growth rates is due to a fall in fertility rates. Let's take a closer look at this second key insight. Consider that population growth is just the difference between the numbers of people born and the numbers of people dying. This is true at a global level. If we examine population growth regionally or at country level, then we should account for migration flows as well. However, globally, if there are more births than deaths, the population grows, otherwise, it falls. Historically, births have been higher than deaths. This explains why total world population has been growing each year. However, the gap between births and deaths has been narrowing, and narrowing quite significantly over the years. This explains why the rate of growth has been falling. Remember, the rate of growth is just the difference between births and deaths. Moreover, the narrowing of the gap between births and deaths is primarily driven by falling birth rates. Changes in birth rates are of course a reflection of changing fertility rates. The data tells us that the average number of births per woman across the world has fallen very significantly from about 5 births per woman in the early 1960s to about 2 births per woman today. So, let's recap. In order to answer the question whether the world population will grow or fall in the future, we need to estimate future population numbers based on key insights we can find from the historical data. There are two key insights. First, the rate of population growth has been falling even though the total numbers have been growing. And the second key insight is that the fall in the rate of growth is due to a fall in global fertility rates. Armed with these key insights, what can we say about future population projections? Is the world population expected to grow or to fall in the future? The answer depends almost entirely on the projection of fertility rates. So far, the data and insights I've shared with you are from the United Nations Population Division, as well as their findings given in their most recent report on population projections. The UN is the world's leading authority on population statistics, and their work feeds into research conducted by many other organizations, such as the World Bank. The UN report states that, when fertility begins to fall, the annual rate of growth starts to drop. Therefore, according to the UN, fertility will be the most important determinant of global population trends in the coming decades. So, what are the projections for global fertility rates? To answer this, let's group projections into the short term and the long term. Short-term projections are from now until 2050. Long-term projections are from 2050 to the end of the century. What can we say about short-term projections? From now until 2050, the UN estimates that fertility rates will continue to drop, reaching an average of 2.15 births per woman. A fall in fertility rates leads to a fall in birth rates, and a further narrowing of the gap between births and deaths. As the gap narrows, then the rate of population growth will continue to fall. However, as births are expected to remain higher than deaths, regardless of the narrowing of the gap, total world population will continue to rise, reaching 9.7 billion by the year 2050. That's a growth of 1.7 billion people from the 8 billion we have today. That's a huge increase. Compare this to the current population of China, the world's largest country, which is 1.4 billion. In a quarter of a century, the world will generate enough additional people to not only create a new China, but will also have enough people left over to create a new Russia and a new Japan, and, even after that, we'll still have people left over. What can we say about long-term projections? So that's from 2050 until the end of the century. The UN expects that fertility rates will continue to drop after 2050. By the end of the century, fertility rates will average 1.84 births per woman. A fall in fertility rates means, of course, a fall in the birth rates. This will lead to a further narrowing of the gap between births and deaths. This narrowing will eventually lead to births dropping below deaths for the first time in the mid-2080s. This is a significant turning point in world population, as this means for the first time the number of people born each year will be less than the number of people dying. So, what does this mean for estimates of total population numbers? World population is expected to peak at 10.4 billion in 2086. After this date, total population will start to decline. The UN, in their report, discussed the possibility of other long-term projections of world population, which are largely based on differing assumptions of future fertility rates. The scenario I've just shared with you is what the UN believes to be their best guess or most likely scenario. Returning to our original question, is the world population expected to grow or to fall in the future? It might seem we now have an answer. The world's population, according to the UN data, is expected to grow from now until 2050. After 2050, the world population will continue to grow, but very slowly, until it reaches a peak of 10.4 billion in the mid-2080s, after which the population will start to fall. However, there is one very important caveat we need to acknowledge with this answer to our question. These projections are just estimates, and as the UN report explicitly points out, the projection of the global population is inherently uncertain, and it typically becomes more uncertain over time. Therefore, our short-term projections, that is from now until 2050, are relatively more certain than our long-term projections. In fact, on the short-term projections, the UN report states that given that most population increase until 2050 will be driven by the momentum of past growth, further actions by governments aimed at reducing fertility would do little to slow the pace of growth between now and mid-century. So, we should expect the population projections to 2050 to very likely occur, regardless of government policy to change the course of these projections. However, the same cannot be said for long-term or long-range projections, which the UN believes are highly uncertain. It is quite possible that government policy to influence changes in population growth may still have time to work. So, I'm afraid the final answer to our question isn't entirely satisfying. The world population is expected to rise, with a high degree of certainty, from now until 2050. The world population is expected to fall towards the end of the century, but there is far more uncertainty with this projection. Perhaps the most important takeaway, as we mentioned previously, is that whatever may be the final answer to our question will depend primarily upon projections of global fertility rates and therefore depend, at least in the long term, upon policy by various governments to influence changes in these rates.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode. Subscribe now to stay informed about our latest podcasts and data stories. The various charts we've created to support our data story can be purchased from our store. Details are in the description.